In 1966, Cincinnati, that quiet, conservative, quintessentially Midwestern city, became completely changed and swallowed up by fear. Locksmiths and hardware stores couldn't keep locks on the shelves. The moment they stocked them, they were gone, and clerks couldn't restock fast enough. On Halloween, residents were outright told by police to take their children trick-or-treating during daylight and be home before dark. What was the reason? A serial killer was stalking the city. From December 1965 to December 1966, a full year, 7 women were strangled to death, each with something different: plastic clotheslines, stockings, bathrobe belts, neckties, electrical cords. Cincinnati police threw together a special task force of 22 officers. They logged over 100 hours of overtime, fielded hundreds of calls daily, and chased down more than 1,000 leads. What they got for their trouble was infuriating. The killer's so cunning he left almost nothing behind, no signs of struggle at the scenes. The victims had likely opened the door for him themselves. The investigators had practically nothing to work with, except for hair found at one scene that pointed to a black man. However, using this as a pretext, the police department launched a massive campaign of stop-and-frisk operations targeting black men throughout Cincinnati. Ultimately, the cost of this incident went far beyond the 7 lives lost. It also exacerbated racial tensions in the city, making Cincinnati one of the first cities to erupt in racial riots during the long, hot summer of 1967. On December 9, 1966, just hours after the final victim was found dead in her apartment building's elevator, police arrested a 29-year-old former taxi driver, Postio Lasky Jr. He was never charged with all 7 murders. He was convicted and sentenced to death for just one, the killing he committed in the taxi. Although that murder bore only a slight resemblance to the modus operandi of the other 6 murders, the police publicly attributed all 7 murders to him, claiming that the serial killings had abruptly ceased after his arrest. There was no properly preserved evidence, no subsequent forensic review, no additional charges. The whole thing just sits there, unresolved. On October 12, 1965, in an apartment in Cincinnati's East Walnut Hills, 65-year-old Emily Harrington was beaten and sexually assaulted by a black man. After the assault, he grabbed a plastic clothesline and wrapped it around her neck, trying to strangle her. Fortunately, whether because he lacked the strength or because their struggle drew a neighbor's attention, the man fled and Emily survived. But shaken by her age and the trauma of the attack, she couldn't give police any useful description of her assailant. So investigators at the time simply treated it as a routine home invasion and sexual assault. No one could have imagined it would turn out to be connected to a serial killing spree. 2 months later, on December 2nd, at the Claremont Apartments in East Walnut Hills, a 56-year-old woman named Emmeline Harrington was found dead in a basement bathroom by a janitor. A plastic clothesline was wrapped around her neck. She'd suffered a severe blow to the head and had been sexually assaulted. While investigating this murder, officers noticed the victim's age and the method of attack, and backtracked to that attempted assault from months earlier. Same neighborhood, same type of weapon, same pattern, victims of similar age. They quickly linked the 2 cases. Clearly, this wasn't some isolated random crime. It was deliberate, selective, and the killer had escalated. He'd moved from a failed attack to a murder. On April 4, 1966, 58-year-old Lois Dant was killed in her Price Hill apartment. Her husband came home from work to find her on the floor, a stocking pulled tight around her neck. On June 10th, 55-year-old Jeanette Messer took her small hound Judy for a walk in Burnett Woods. Not long after, someone found her naked body beside a stone step, a necktie wrapped around her neck. Judy had been tied to a nearby tree, barking the whole time. Faced with this mounting horror, the Cincinnati Police Department formed a special task force, 22 officers assigned exclusively to the case. No days off, over 100 hours of overtime logged, and they chased down more than 1,000 leads. Meanwhile, as murders continue to happen, the media went into overdrive with their breathless, sensational coverage. Headlines screaming things like "The Strangler strikes again," That barrage of news sent Cincinnati's women into a full-blown panic. They canceled shopping trips, skipped social outings, and just stayed home. Locksmiths and hardware stores sold out of locks completely. One patrolman put it bluntly: the locksmiths and the hardware stores couldn't keep locks in stock. There was a huge demand for them. Because of the hysteria, everybody was absolutely petrified. In 1966, Halloween trick-or-treating got moved to daylight hours, but the killer remained at large. Although the police have repeatedly urged the public to be vigilant and even issued self-defense tips in newspapers, biting, kicking, screaming, and catching people, fear still spreads in the city like a disease. In the early hours of August 14th, 31-year-old Barbara Bowman had barely stepped out of a bar in Corryville. Not long after, witnesses found her covered in blood, collapsed on the ground. Next to her sat an abandoned taxi. Its driver mysteriously vanished. The autopsy was grim. Barbara had been stabbed 7 times, sexually assaulted, bore strangulation marks on her neck, and had injuries consistent with being run over by the taxi itself. Investigators searching the abandoned taxi found her wallet, a bloody paring knife, and a length of rope. The message was unmistakable. Barbara had been a passenger. That paring knife was the murder weapon, and the missing taxi driver was almost certainly the killer. They also found hair left behind by the driver, confirmed to belong to a black man. And witnesses reported seeing the vehicle stopped with a man and woman inside, apparently asking for directions. With that lead in hand, police launched a massive sweep across Cincinnati. They started with known sex offenders, since sexual motivation seemed the most likely driver of Barbara's death. But as time dragged on, their net widened grotesquely to encompass all black men. Tall, short, heavy, thin. On October 12th, 51-year-old Alice Hockhauser was found in her home, also sexually assaulted and strangled to death. She was a nurse with a daughter, and that day she decided to pick her daughter up to keep her safe from the killer. Instead, she became the victim herself, strangled with a bathrobe belt. Just 8 days later, on October 20th, 81-year-old Rose Winstall was killed in her home. She'd been savagely beaten, and her killer used the cord from her electric blanket to strangle her. On December 9th, 81-year-old Lula Carrick was found dead in the elevator of the Brittany apartment building downtown. When the elevator reached the 3rd floor, residents found her lying on the floor, a stocking wrapped around her neck. She was the only victim who hadn't been sexually assaulted. Just hours earlier that same day, 31-year-old Sandra Chapas had been followed to her apartment door by a black man. He only left after Sandra rushed inside and slammed the door shut. Fortunately, her neighbor had the presence of mind to jot down the license plate of the car the man was driving. Investigators ran the plate and traced it to the owner, 29-year-old Posteel Lasky Jr. Lasky was already on probation, having been convicted in 1965 of assaulting and raping a 22-year-old woman, for which he'd received 3 years probation. And between July and December 1962, he'd worked as a taxi driver for Yellow Cab Company. When investigators questioned the company's management, they got something crucial. After getting fired, Lasky had taken the ignition key and some other items he was supposed to turn in home with him. At the time, every single car at Yellow Cab Company used the same ignition key. And on the night of August 13th and into the early morning of the 14th, a taxi numbered 186 had been stolen. When investigators showed witnesses Lasky's photo, they confirmed without hesitation. The man in that car asking for directions that night was him. So Lasky was officially tied to Barbara's murder. During interrogation, his defense team trotted out an alibi, insisting he was at home when Barbara was killed, with 5 witnesses backing up his story. They also accused police of coercion, painting Lasky as a man from a disadvantaged background with only minor prior offenses who absolutely shouldn't face the death penalty. The prosecution's strategy was to anchor Lasky to Barbara's death through witness testimony identifying him as the taxi driver who'd picked her up shortly before she vanished. Their main evidence was what they'd found in that taxi: Barbara's wallet, the bloody paring knife, the rope. And they leaned hard on the fact that the Cincinnati Stranglings had simply stopped after his arrest, letting the public link Lasky and the Strangler. On April 13, 1967, Lasky was found guilty in Barbara's murder and sentenced to death in the electric chair. Then, in 1972, when the U.S. Supreme Court put a nationwide moratorium on executions, his sentence got commuted to life imprisonment. After that, he bounced around from prison to prison. In February 2007, 69-year-old Lasky was denied parole yet again, and on May 29th of that same year, he died and was buried right there in the prison. And back in 1967, right after Lasky's death sentence came down, his cousin Peter stood outside the courthouse protesting. He had a sign slung over his shoulders that read, "Cincinnati guilty, Lasky innocent." Police warned him multiple times to move along, and when he refused, they arrested him for blocking the sidewalk. But that arrest lit a fuse in the black community, because during the entire Cincinnati Strangler investigation, police had conducted those sweeping searches and interrogations of black men based on nothing but skin color. So Lasky's conviction was seen by many as yet another example of the justice system's systemic bias against black people. Just a few months later, on June 12th, right where Peter had been arrested, a massive crowd of demonstrators erupted into a full-blown uprising. They faced off against police, surrounded squad cars, hurled Molotov cocktails, and set fires. In the end, 63 people were injured, and one person was dead. From the moment Lasky was arrested to the day he was convicted, he never once stood trial for the other 6 Cincinnati Strangler murders. He was only convicted for Barbara's murder, and Barbara's case was different. Stabbing, rape, strangulation. Not the clean, pure strangulation method that defined the Strangler's pattern. The police's reasoning for pinning all 7 on him, partial similarities in technique, and the fact that similar crimes just stopped after his arrest. But that's circumstantial at best. It isn't a complete chain of evidence. And because the evidence was so old, because there were no properly preserved biological samples, and because no systematic forensic review, including DNA analysis, was ever conducted in the decades since, and no additional charges were ever brought. So, in this day, the Cincinnati Strangler case remains unsolved. It just hangs there, unresolved.